Evan Park, and I'll be reading St. Patrick from Stories of the Saints, written by Carrie Wallace and illustrated by Nick Thornborough. Patrick was just a teenager when he was captured by Irish pirates. They threw him on a boat and sailed with him from his home in Scotland to the island of Ireland, where they sold him to an Irish king who sent Patrick out into the fields to herd his sheep. Back in Scotland, Patrick's grandfather was a priest and his father was a deacon. But Patrick had never thought much about God until he had to live in slavery. Now, in a strange land far from home, with nobody else to talk with but God, he started to pray. He prayed all day and all night in the woods and on the mountains. One day, when Patrick had been herding the Irish king's sheep for several years, he had a dream. "You'll go home soon," a voice told him. "Your ship is ready." Patrick was more than 100 miles from any ocean. He didn't have any money, and if he escaped, the Irish king would be furious. But that night, Patrick slipped away from his captors and set out across a country he didn't know, looking for a boat he had never seen before. Days later, he reached the coast, and there was a ship, just as the voice in the dream had promised. Not only that, but the boat was from Scotland, just loaded up with a cargo of Irish wolfhounds and ready to sail. But when Patrick begged the captain to take him home, the captain refused. Why had God led Patrick all this way if the captain wouldn't even let him on the boat? As Patrick turned away, he prayed for help. "Come back!" the sailors from the ship called as he finished praying. "The captain's changed his mind." After the ship set sail with Patrick on it, a giant storm came up on the sea. It drove them onto a shore none of them recognized and broke their boat on the rocks. The land there was stony and barren, with no cities and no crops, and the sailors wandered through it with all the dogs for almost a month, lost and hungry. "If your God is so powerful," they finally asked Patrick, "why doesn't he help us?" So Patrick prayed. As he did, a herd of wild boars appeared, enough for the men and dogs to hunt so they could eat their fill until they all found their way back. When Patrick got home, his family was overjoyed to see him. But not long after, Patrick had a dream. In it, a man from Ireland appeared, carrying a bundle of letters. He handed one to Patrick. When Patrick opened it, he could hear voices of the people he'd known in Ireland calling together, "Please, come back." Patrick studied for several years, first to become a priest and then a bishop. But as soon as he got permission from the church, he headed back to Ireland, where he preached to everyone he met, poor people and rich women, chieftains and the sons of kings. On the first Easter after Patrick arrived in Ireland, he decided to light a fire on Easter morning on a hill near the castle of High King Leary. The day was also a pagan feast, and King Leary had given strict orders that nobody light a fire until he lit one in his own castle. So when he woke up and saw Patrick's fire on the hill to celebrate the rising of Jesus from the dead, the king was furious. He sentenced Patrick to death and rode out with his queen and sorcerers and nobles to capture him. But when they arrived, Patrick prayed. A great darkness descended on everyone, and Patrick and his followers escaped. Next day, at the height of the king's feast, Patrick and his followers appeared in the great hall, even though all the doors were locked and shut. Welcome, one of the king's sorcerers said, handing Patrick a cup of poisoned wine. But when Patrick blessed the cup, all the wine froze solid. The poison just sloshed around on top, and Patrick turned the cup over and poured it out. So the sorcerer challenged Patrick to a contest of magic. Let's have a hut built of wood, he said. We'll set it on fire and stand inside and see which one of us can withstand the flames. But the sorcerer had a trick up his sleeve. When the hut was built, he ordered the builders to make half of it using green wood, which almost never burns, and half of it using dry wood, which catches fire at the tiniest spark. His plan was to stand on the green side, which he believed wouldn't burn, while Patrick burned up on the dry side. As everyone at the feast watched, the sorcerer took his spot on the green side, and Patrick's student, Benignus, stood in the side made of dry wood. A servant of the king plunged a burning torch into the house to light it. But when the house began to burn, the green side burst into such hot flame that the sorcerer was turned to cinders. And when the whole house had burned to nothing more than ash, there stood Patrick's student, Benignus, without a burn or a scratch on him. For the next 40 years, Patrick lived in Ireland, founding churches and monasteries and baptizing thousands. He taught people to do what was right, not just obey whoever was strongest. He spoke out against slavery and the British priests who turned a blind eye to it. He refused gifts from royalty, but he gave away any money he had to both poor people and kings. And he loved to use the Irish shamrock with its 3 leaves to explain the Trinity, how God can be 3 people in one. Wherever Patrick went, he asked God to be with him and believed he'd find God there. As he wrote in his prayer, the breastplate, Christ be within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. When Patrick died, there was no night for 12 days. And for the whole year after his death, the night was not as dark as it had been. The end.